Hello and welcome to the digestive system, part 1. This is histology. So if we look at the cartoon on the slide, we'll start at the top with the mouth, the oral cavity. So the oral cavity obviously contains the tongue and the teeth. And into the oral cavity, the salivary glands secrete saliva. And the salivary glands have a little asterisk by the word glands, and that means that the salivary glands and all the other organs, so the pancreas and the liver and the gallbladder, all have a little asterisk by them, and that means that they're not part of the main tube of the digestive system, but rather they're accessory structures to the tube within the digestive system. So the tube is called the GI tract, and the GI tract plus the accessory organs together make up the digestive system. So there's 3 salivary glands. There's a parotid gland, the sublingual, so that sub is right underneath the tongue, and the submandibular gland. So if you remember from 201, the bone is the mandible, and that's where the submandibular gland lives. So from the oral cavity, if you're going throughout the gastrointestinal tract or GI tract, the next structure you would go into would be the pharynx. And there is a oropharynx and a nasopharynx and a laryngopharynx. So there's 3 parts of the pharynx. And the common name for pharynx is the throat. From the pharynx, you would, if you were traveling through the tube, you would hit the esophagus as the next structure. And then from the esophagus, you'd go into the stomach. And then from the stomach, you go into the small intestine. And also the liver makes chemicals, makes bile, and stored in the gallbladder, and then the gallbladder can secrete that bile into the small intestine. And there's 3 parts to the small intestine. The most proximal part, proximal to the stomach, that is the duodenum, and then the jejunum, and the ileum is most distal from the stomach. And then from the ileum, you go into the large intestine. So there is an ileocecal junction where the ileum then turns into the cecum. From the cecum, you go up the ascending colon. Then you go transverse or across the colon, called the transverse colon. Then you go down again, the descending colon. And then you get sort of an S-shaped curve in the colon called the sigmoid colon. From there, you go to the appendix, from the rectum you go to the anal canal. And then the appendix actually is it's called a vestigial remain, so we don't really use it that much, but it is connected to the cecum. So then it shows you on the right-hand side that the large intestine then is composed of those parts of the colon plus the rectum, the anal canal, and the anus. So this is more of a histological cartoon of the general structure of the tube part, so the GI tract, aka the gastrointestinal tract. So let's start in the center of the tube. So if you look in the center of the tube, we've seen this motif before. In blood vessels, you have a blood vessel lumen. It's the same thing with the GI tract. If we find the lumen, that's the space inside the tube. And then more superficial to the lumen is the mucosa. So that's the mucosa is comprised of an epithelium, so those are epithelial cells. And then, like I've said before, the cells always, whatever cell type, they usually, unless they're blood cells, have to sit on something. So the epithelial cells of the mucosa sit on the lamina propria, which is a loose connective tissue. And then superficial to the lamina propria is the muscularis mucosae, and it's got the word muscle in it, so you can imagine it's smooth muscle cells, and that's what it is. The muscularis mucosae are smooth muscle cells running longitudinally. So if you look closely at the cartoon, you can see in the muscularis mucosae the spindle-shaped smooth muscle cells are running longitudinally. And then superficial to the mucosa is the submucosa, and that again is a loose connective tissue. And all the red tubes, of course, are arteries and arterioles, and the blue tubes within the submucosa are veins, and then the green tubes are lymph nodes. So then superficial to the submucosa would be the muscularis externa. And the muscularis externa has two parts, a longitudinal smooth muscle component and a circular smooth muscle component. So the inner muscularis externa is circular smooth muscle, and the outer muscularis externa is longitudinal smooth muscle. And then also, I forgot to mention, in the submucosa there are glands. You can see their yellow structures, and the glands have ducts that secrete, allow the secretions to go into the lumen of the GI tract. So then the most superficial layer would be the serosa. And the serosa is comprised of an epithelium, but because it's on the GI tract, they call it a mesothelium. The serosa also has within it a sort of a loose connective tissue made of collagen. And let's see, I think that's it. There's the green structures in the submucosa are mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT, and that, of course, is tissue that contains immune system cells like macrophages and B cells and T cells. So lining the lumen is an epithelium, and the specific histological type is a non-keratinized stratified squamous, where you have an increased probability for abrasion, like the oral cavity and the esophagus and the anal canal. All those parts of the GI tract, all those parts of the tube see a lot of traffic, so to speak, and they have a tendency to be abraded, so you have a stratified squamous. So if the layers wear off, you still got layers beneath. If you are in the small intestine, for example, or the stomach, there's less possibility for abrasion, so the histological cell type is a simple columnar. And then whether you're in stratified squamous or simple columnar, you have tight junctions between the cells. In the simple columnar cells, you have microvilli. So microvilli are just the projections of the plasma membrane that help increase the surface area. There are also endocrine glands found throughout the GI tract that can secrete hormones. And then, like I said in the previous slide, the epithelium of the GI tract has to sit on something. Those cells need to sit on something. They sit on a lamina propria that is composed of loose, aka areolar connective tissue. And BV stands for blood vessels, and LV is, of course, lymph vessels. And we talked about the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. And then the muscularis mucosae, like I said, was smooth muscle cells. A little bit more about the submucosa. It's a thicker connective tissue compared with the lamina propria, and it has larger blood vessels and larger lymph vessels versus the lamina propria. And then also within the submucosa is a nerve plexus. It's called the submucosal or Meissner's nerve plexus, and it controls secretions throughout the GI tract. And then also within the submucosa are glands that can secrete a mucus. The muscularis externa, we talked about that. There's a longitudinal smooth muscle and a inner circular smooth muscle. But at the beginning of the GI tract, the beginning of the tube, you have skeletal muscle. So in the oral cavity and the parts of the larynx, and then also in the anal canal, you have in the rectum, you have skeletal muscle. So those are obviously skeletal muscle. You can control that muscle versus smooth muscle cells, which you can't control. And then wherever there's, you don't find skeletal muscle, so the whole, most of the tract has smooth muscle cells. So the inner circular muscle layer is called the Auerbach's plexus. The inner circular muscle contains a nervous system plexus called the myenteric plexus. The outer longitudinal smooth muscle, of course, that's smooth muscle cells. And then only in the stomach you find, along with the inner circular and the outer longitudinal muscle, you find this extra muscle layer called the oblique muscle to help mixing in the stomach. Then the serosa is a thin areolar connective tissue, and it's also, the serosa has its histological type is a simple squamous epithelium that secretes a watery fluid. And if you are in the part of the tube that is above the diaphragm and covering the esophagus, then you are called not a serosa but an adventitia, and it's fibrous connective tissue that covers the esophagus versus this serosa that covers the part of the tube that is below the diaphragm. And then we'll look, when we get into the lab, we'll look at these slides, but this is a cross-section of the tube from the small intestine. So if you look at the bottom, it shows you the serosa, and remember that's a squamous epithelial cell type that secretes a watery fluid. And then the outer muscularis externa that runs longitudinally, and the inner circular smooth muscle of the muscularis externa. And then it says there are duodenal glands, so this part of the tube would be from the duodenum. And then there are these things called the crypt and villus structure in the small intestine that just help increase the surface area of the tube for optimal absorption of nutrients, those nutrients being amino acids and simple sugars and lipids. And we will look at these slides in the laboratory. Okay, that's it.